This is a poem called The Road Home by Rumi, Coleman Barks translation. An ant hurries along a threshing floor with its wheat grain, moving between huge stacks of wheat, not knowing the abundance all around. It thinks its one grain is all there is to love. So we choose a tiny seed to be devoted to, this body, one path or one teacher. Look wider and farther. The essence of every human being can see, and what that essence eye takes in, the being becomes. Saturn, Solomon, the ocean pours through a jar, and you might say it swims inside the fish. This mystery gives peace to your longing and makes the road home, home. Hi everybody, I'm Brandon Thompson. Thank you for taking some time to watch this video and hear what I have to say about ecstatic poetry. I'll tell you a little bit about myself first. I'm a Buddhist practitioner and teacher and have been for close to 20 years now. I'm a transpersonal educator and a spiritual guide. Until fairly recently, I was a faculty member at Sophia University, which is a leader in the world for transpersonal, transformative education. I had that career for 10 years. And I've been writing poetry all my life. I've been a poet since I was very young. And around early adulthood, I discovered this thing called ecstatic poetry. And it was the same time in my life, it was at about the same time in my life when my spirituality was beginning to open up and blossom. I was discovering some deeper ideas than the spirituality I grew up with. I was discovering Buddhism, Eastern religions, beginning to study, beginning to find teachers and reading, and kind of dovetailing with that, co-emerging with that spiritual study, was ecstatic poetry. Probably the poetry of well-known names that you might know, Rumi and Hafiz and Juan de la Cruz and Kabir. Many of the most popular ecstatic poets came into my life. The books were probably just hanging out at the Buddhist centers where I was hanging out. And I remember how it felt to hear my truth, kind of to hear my heart or my spirit in the words of these poets. It felt different. I remember how distinctly different ecstatic poetry felt from other types of poetry that I was reading or that I had read previously in my life. So that began my path. That was many, many years ago. And since that time, I've been writing and reading and studying and teaching ecstatic poetry, actually all over the world, all over the country and the world. I've been developing theory and practice and teaching modalities that I've shared with workshop groups, again, kind of all over the United States and Canada for almost a decade. And I'm here to share some of that work with you and my love and passion for the practice and path of ecstatic poetry, which has changed my life. And I'm here because I think if it's right for you, it can change your life too. So often I'm asked, and I often also ask myself, what is ecstatic? What is the ecstatic? What does this word mean? You know, in our common parlance, we say, I'm ecstatic. It means I'm very happy. That's not the etymology of this particular use of this particular word that we mean or that we're pointing towards when we talk about ecstatic poetry. So the root of the word ecstatic comes from the Greek ekstasis. And I love it. I love the look and the feel of a word because it has a K instead of a C. Ekstasis. And translated, it means to stand outside of oneself and kind of look down and observe at what's going on with ourselves. So there's an element in this word ekstasis, in this experience of ekstasis or ecstasy, of being separate from what? How about from the churning and whirling and obsessing of our daily habitual mind and thoughts? Being separate from ego, that part of us that is so oftentimes protected, sometimes sad, sometimes angry or fearful. So one of the main ideas behind ecstatic poetry and the experience of ekstasis at large, which is not exclusive, of course, to just ecstatic poetry, one of the main ideas is that it can separate ourselves or pull us out of this mundane, daily grind of fear, negativity, and sadness, and concern, and anger, and obsession. There's something about this experience that I think is spiritual. Absolutely, the experience of ekstasis and the experiences of really working with and writing ecstatic poetry and reading ecstatic poetry can be for you, and certainly are for me and many poets that I know and lovers of poetry, can be a spiritual experience. So I'm here to share that with you. So to say just a little bit more about the experience of ekstasis, which is this kind of spiritual experience, perhaps this mystical experience or journey that we can go on through ecstatic poetry, reading and practice. It has also something to do with self-transcendence, right? That's kind of inherent in this definition. When we pull ourselves out of the mundanity of our experience, that is self-transcendence. And many scholars and deep thinkers about literature and poetry agree that this experience of ekstasis can be transcendent. It can be healing. There's a word I've learned through my study of ecstatic poetry. The word is eudaimonia. I had never heard that word before. It points towards just a general sense of human well-being. So this experience of ekstasis and writing and reading ecstatic poetry it also just makes us feel good. It contributes to our well-being. There's a beautiful quote by an author, D.J. Moores, who I think, in at least my study and experience, is the preeminent scholar of ecstatic poetry in the world today. He has this quote that goes like this: "The gratification of the need for ecstatic experience is a kind of single ultimate value, as Abraham Maslow called the drive towards self-actualization. The good life is thus not complete without ecstasy." So I'm saying something radical, I think, to you. I'm saying that the experience of ecstasy, eudaimonia, self-transcendence, this mystical spiritual experience, one, is possible in many ways throughout our human lives. But more importantly, it's possible through the vehicle of ecstatic poetry. So let's dive into the history of ecstatic poetry and see what we can churn up from the history books. So I mentioned earlier that I discovered ecstatic poetry through the writing of primarily the two Persian masters. They're the ecstatic writers that I think the world is most familiar with, Rumi and Hafiz, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about them later. For years, I was under the illusion that this is where ecstatic writing started, until I actually started to study ecstatic writing. Ecstatic writing is just about as ancient as writing is. It can first be found in ancient Greek writing, which was a surprising fact to me, but when you think about it, it makes sense. If ecstatic writing is first present, we can trace it all the way back. It kind of appeared in Orphic hymns, writing by the ancient Greeks to honor their demigod Orpheus. You might be familiar with the big vases and pots that we see in museums that often depict Greek gods and demigods. They're oftentimes black and orange, and the vases are beautiful. They're works of art in themselves. Oftentimes we see a being, a human, with a lyre, and he's singing his songs. Those are depictions of Orpheus, again, the Greek demigod, and the songs that he's singing are ecstatic poetry. I'll share one with you now. Eternal fires, source of all below, with flames significant of fate ye shine, and aptly rule for men a path divine. In 7 bright zones ye run with wandering flames, and heaven and earth compose your lucid frames, with course unwearied, pure and fiery bright, forever shining through the veil of night. This comes from 550 BCE, so ecstatic verse is far more ancient than I initially thought. Ecstatic verse moves through all of history and human cultures. Ecstatic verse can be found in the East, in the Indian corpus, in the Rig Veda, which is a root text of Hinduism. It can be found in the root texts of Buddhism. The great Buddhist sage Milarepa wrote the Bodhicharyavatara, which is the way of the Bodhisattva. It's a root text in Mahayana Buddhism, and it's an epic poem. It can be compared to Homer's the Iliad or the Odyssey, just from the East. And it's a beautiful, profound work of transformation. It's a sacred text, but it's just an epic, ecstatic poem, not unlike the Iliad or the Odyssey. Ecstatic writing, I mentioned, can be found through the entire world, multicultural across all cultures. It can be found in South America. It can be traced to pre-Columbian Mexico in the writing of some of the Nahuatl poet kings. And then, a little bit more contemporarily, we might think of beat poetry. The work of our friend Jack Kerouac can certainly be identified, most of his work, as ecstatic poetry. This is the briefest condensation of the history of ecstatic verse. There's a lot more information on my website that you can find out about the history of ecstatic verse if you feel inclined to study, or perhaps take a course with me, or reach out and contact me. There's a lot that I have to offer you in the world of ecstatic poetry, but I think for now, let's move on to something new. The next thing I'd like to talk about is this idea of visionary art. Visionary art is a paradigm that's really kind of been moving in the world here, especially here in our Western culture, since about the 1980s, the early 1980s. You might ask, what is visionary art exactly? Maybe you've heard the term, maybe you haven't heard the term. The best and simplest way that we can kind of describe or define visionary art is that it's art, so it's a subgenre of art, which is a big umbrella, I know, that encourages introspection, deep inner seeing. It's art that encourages ekstasis, right? This kind of separation from self, this kind of mystical experience. There are many pioneers in visionary art. I think certainly the most popular name is the well-known painter Alex Gray, who paints these absolutely gorgeous, very transcendent, sometimes very trippy paintings, oftentimes including human bodies with no skin. And they look like I think they're called the X-ray bodies. A part of the visionary art movement that I notice as a writer, so my art isn't painting. My art is actually not a visual art. My art is poetry. Something I've noticed about the visionary art movement, which is clearly something I love and resonate with and identify with very, very much, there seems to be, at least in my experience or through my window or through my lens, there seems to be a preference that I notice in the visionary art community for visual art, especially paintings. A quick Google search for visionary art will show you thousands of beautiful, transcendent works of visual art. In fact, I encourage you to do that. But I'm here with the same mission, but from a different perspective, from a different lens. I'm here because ecstatic poetry is also visionary art. All the core tenets of visionary art are present in ecstatic poetry. There's a theorist, a writer, and an artist from the 16th century, Saint Bonaventure. Saint Bonaventure had this lovely model for art. Of course, the term visionary art wasn't around back then, but it's called the 3 eyes model. The eye of the flesh, the eye of reason, and the eye of spirit. And I'd like to share a little bit about those the 3 eyes from Saint Bonaventure's model, because it's really a great way to come to understand visionary art and ecstatic poetry, and how ecstatic poetry has a place in the visionary art paradigm. So I'll share a little tiny bit about that. It's really a hierarchical model. So with each step we progress actually down a little bit deeper into our intuitive knowing, into our essence. So the eye of the flesh really just kind of indicates that we're taking in art, we're receiving any art, a song, a dance, a play, a painting, a poem. We're taking it in, and we're just kind of at a place where we're only understanding its base value. That's a painting, and it's lovely. This model, this kind of visionary art theory, suggests that there's much more to art than just the eye of the flesh. There's the eye of reason. The eye of reason is the middle level of Saint Bonaventure's 3 eyes model, and it's kind of at this place when we as the recipients, the viewers, the people who are taking in art, it's at this level that we begin to see correspondences between art and its deeper meaning. I love this example. There's this great example about Beethoven's 6th Symphony, which you may or may not know is often called his pastoral symphony. And people have claimed for centuries that when they hear Beethoven's 6th Symphony, they can see the pastures and the rolling hills. They can see the beautiful, the billowy clouds, and they can see the cows and the horses. There's one account that I read during my study. Someone said, when I listen to Beethoven's 6th Symphony, I can smell the cow shit. And so those people who are beginning to really feel the deeper meaning of that particular piece of art are receiving it through their eye of reason. And finally, there's the eye of the spirit. The eye of the spirit is when we receive art, and it informs us about our essence. It informs us about our life journey in some way. It is this mystical experience. It's definitely comparable to the experience of ekstasis. When we receive art, and art can give us a mystical experience. So I wonder if anyone out there, I wonder if you have received any art, whether it's a glorious ecstatic visionary painting, or a song that has changed you fundamentally, a piece of music or a play or a poem. This is the paradigm of visionary art, and part of my mission here today, part of my mission in the world as an ongoing journey is to share these very transformative faculties, these very transformative capabilities or capacities that visionary art possesses in the world, regarding ecstatic poetry, or about ecstatic poetry. Ecstatic poetry is visionary art. Now I'd like to move on to why specifically I think that. So you came here probably because the title of this video is What is Ecstatic Poetry? And we've talked about a lot. But what is ecstatic poetry? I don't claim to have all the answers, but I claim surely to have found my own answers, and I'd like to share those with you today. After years and years of study, contemplation, teaching ecstatic poetry, really collaborating with other people, other poets, other writers, other visionary artists, myself and my poet partners, my collaborators, we've come up with a definition for ecstatic poetry, something that we really feel like puts a pin in, or answers the question, what is ecstatic poetry? And I'm excited to share it with you today. So I'd like to share it, and then I'd like to kind of unpack it a little bit and break it down and talk about what it means. The definition statement goes like this. Ecstatic poetry is a devotional practice which seeks to connect both poet and reader to their innate longing for their essence. I'll say it one more time. Ecstatic poetry is a devotional practice which seeks to connect both poet and reader to their innate longing for their essence. So let's unpack that for a little while. As best I can reckon, as best I can discern, there are four kind of beats or four kind of core elements present in our definition statement. The first one is devotion or devotional practice. The second one is connection, right? So devotion, connection. The third one is longing, this innate longing. And what are we longing for? Well, according to this idea, we're longing for essence. So let's start there. Let's start with this idea of essence. When we were first crafting this definition statement, this mission, this pin that we wanted to put into the world of ecstatic poetry and say, this is who we are, this is what this is. There was the first and kind of most primordial element of ecstatic poetry was this idea of transcendence, this idea of me and God, whoever God is, sitting together in a room, communing with one another, learning from one another, experiencing one another. But we didn't want to use the word God. God is a very charged word in most cultures in the world today. And when we settled on essence, this idea of our personal essence, if you will, essence capital E, it immediately felt right. So maybe we'll kind of go through the definition statement in a bit of a reverse order, because the next piece of it is longing. Who doesn't feel a longing for something that's a little bit elusive, something that's out there? In Buddhism, there's this concept of dukkha. Dukkha is a Sanskrit word that is often translated incorrectly to just suffering. Just suffering. There's this misconception that Buddhism is this dismal practice or spiritual path. In fact, this Buddhist idea of dukkha is better translated as pervasive unsatisfactoriness. Everyone, all of you who are watching this video right now, and myself absolutely included, experience this idea of dukkha, pervasive unsatisfactoriness. There's something that isn't quite right with my life, something I want that I can't quite reach out and touch, some longing for something that's elusive to me. Khalil Gibran said, "In the will of man there is a longing that turns the mist inside us to sun." And that's precisely the idea behind this ecstatic poetry definition statement, that we can harness our longings, use our longings that have for most of our lives felt almost like a hindrance. Why am I longing for this elusive thing that I can't quite reach out and touch? In ecstatic poetry, in this paradigm of ecstatic poetry, we say, aha, but your longing can turn that mist inside you into sun. You can use your longing in the practice of ecstatic poetry, harness it to tap into or contact your essence, or, if you like, the idea of God inside of you. So backing up a little bit further in the mission statement, there's this idea of connection. Ecstatic poetry is a devotional practice that seeks to connect, right? And that's this idea. The idea is that we're going to first connect with our longing. Stop calling it names. Oh, I wish I didn't have this longing. Oh, I wish it would just go away. I wish I could sate this thing. And instead we're going to reach out and touch it. The practice and path of ecstatic poetry, and by the way, I don't just mean writing ecstatic poetry, I certainly mean just loving ecstatic poetry, reading ecstatic poetry, will allow you to reach out and stop being so afraid, and touch your longing for what? For your own essence. Finally, there's an element of practice. And I like this element. The definition statement begins with this idea of practice. It immediately tells us ecstatic poetry is so powerful and can do such good in our lives, but you can't be lazy about it. You can't just read a poem and expect magic to happen. You can't just write a poem and expect all your problems to be solved. So we, myself and my collaborators in the ecstatic poetry community, we believe that in order to kind of sink down in this journey towards our essences, the first thing we have to do is commit to practicing with understanding ecstatic poetry, writing ecstatic poetry, reading ecstatic poetry. I'd like to tell you one more time, ecstatic poetry is a devotional practice that seeks to connect both poet and reader to their innate longing for their essence. This definition statement has been tried and true in lots of ways. We've taken it on the road, we've shared it with writers and poets, with literary scholars, with teachers, faculty members at various universities, and everyone has kind of had the same response. Oh, yeah, that is what it does. That is what it is. So I hope it makes sense to you, and I hope that you can, if it's right for you over time, learn to wield ecstatic poetry as a force for good and positive change and transformation in your lives. So we've come on a journey together in this video. I hope that what you've watched and what I've shared has been clarifying for you, maybe helpful. My intention in sharing all of this is to help the world understand just what ecstatic poetry is and how profound it can be in our lives. So I'd like to end by reading some ecstatic poems, right? I haven't read anything really, maybe just a few small things. So I want to share some ecstatic poems with you. I'll start with one of mine and I'll finish with some beautiful ecstatic poetry from across history. And as you're listening, I hope you hear those elements, the beats of ecstatic poetry. I hope that these poems, now that you've heard a little bit more about ecstatic poetry, I hope that you can feel them in your essence. I'll begin by saying this beautiful quote by Alex Grey. Alex Grey, you might remember, one of the pioneers of visionary art. He writes, "Finding that fountain of creation, an art spirit, is the artist's task. Artists must remain open to the tumultuous ocean of potential inspiration always, in order to provide tangible evidence of inner discovery to the outer world." And if I were to give the most pithy definition of ecstatic poetry or any visionary art, it would be exactly that. We all have the capacity for inner discovery. We discover something in our inner worlds all the time. We imbibe meaning, like a flower imbibes water and nutrients up out of the soil all the time. And visionary art is just a place where we can take that inner discovery and share it with the outer world. That's my mission as an ecstatic poet and a teacher of ecstatic poetry. This is a poem called Invocation that I wrote for From the Back of a Thirsty Camel, one of my books. It goes like this. "And so it is that I begin. Words of the ages come. Words of the sages come. Words of truth be mine this night, that you might set those hearts aflight which for far too long have been held to ground, and might with love set skyward bound. Come to me, my words of fire. I seek you fullest, my true desire, like the ageless swordsman at his craft. Toward the stars I sail my raft. May words I write, my songs of spirit, fly like sparks that all may hear it, and fuse sweet heaven and ground below. The two are one, may all men know. Come to me, heaven, come to me, earth, you two is one which gave me birth, mantle to mantle and crust to crust, that my humble words might raise from dust sweet new life to deadened ears, as the masters have from ancient years. Inspiration is my breath, I exhale words onto the page. Where once was darkness, pain, and death, the power of words will light this age. I set these words as solemn prayer. and hold those eyes in tender care, who chance to read an open heart to this simple swordsman at his art. In silence now, on bended knee, I offer up my sword, that you might hone and forge my heart. I sing my prayer to word. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video that when I first began contacting ecstatic poetry, I was under this illusion that it kind of started and maybe was exclusive to those Persian masters, Rumi and Hafiz. To me, it felt like this mystical, otherworldly, perhaps Eastern or Asian practice. And I couldn't imagine ecstatic verse being found in the West. I shared that story right before I shared this poem because how wrong I was. This is a poem by Emily Dickinson, who I really didn't even like or appreciate before I started studying ecstatic poetry. The poem goes like this. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side. The one the other will include with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue. The one the other will absorb, as sponges, buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. Talk about connection to something. God, essence, right there it is, in Emily Dickinson's writing. This is a poem by Rumi, the Coleman Barks translation. If you never searched for truth, come with us, and you will become a seeker. If you were never a musician, come with us, and you will find your voice. You may possess immense wealth, come with us, and you will become a beggar. You may think yourself a master, come with us, and love will turn you into a slave. If you've lost your spirit, come with us. Take off your silk coverings, put on your rough cloak, and we will bring you back to life. In our gathering, one candle lights hundreds. We will light your path and give you courage, so you will open like a flower and join our joyous laughter. Plant the seed of truth and watch it grow. When it spreads its branches, come with us and sit under its blossoms. Your eyes will open to the secret of truth. And that is what ecstatic poetry can do. I think my favorite ecstatic poet might be Hafiz. Hafiz, who had a vocabulary for God, 50 different words for God or the spiritual connection, religious experience. Hafiz, who was always drunk, but not on wine or alcohol. Hafiz, who was always drunk on spirit, his own spirituality. The crazy wisdom writer, poet. Hafiz, who said, a poet will pour light into a cup and raise it to sate your holy, parched mouth. This is a poem called Venus Just Asked Me by the Daniel Ladinsky translation. Perhaps for just 1 minute out of the day, it may be of value to torture yourself with thoughts like, I should be doing a hell of a lot more with my life than I am, 'cause I'm so damn talented. But remember, for just 1 minute out of the day, with all the rest of your time, it would be best to try looking upon yourself more as God does, for He knows your true royal nature. God is never confused and can only see Himself in you. My dear, Venus just leaned down and asked me to confess, to tell you a secret, that she's just a mirror who's been stealing your light and music for centuries. She knows, as does Hafiz, that you are the sole heir to the kingdom. So, that's what ecstatic poetry can do. That's what ecstatic poetry is, to me. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your interest in ecstatic poetry, poetry as a visionary art. I hope you'll continue to explore more of what I have to offer and what ecstatic poetry has to offer out in the world. Bye.